Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Deason and I'm joined today by the great Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss Trump's first 2 weeks back in office and how to make sense of it all. And yeah, it's great to see you again.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So again, we're just 2 weeks into the Trump presidency and so much is happening so fast it becomes a bit hard to follow. But overall, it seems that Trump is concerned about the United States overextending itself. I guess what can be termed imperial overstretch as the US exhausts itself from within and rival powers have increasing advantage in terms of collectively balancing the United States. So it appears, at least to me, that Trump is pursuing some form of retrenchment strategy and reprioritization. That is, thinking that the U.S. must reduce its commitment to certain parts of the world, primarily scale back its military commitments in Europe, in the Middle East, and instead prioritize on competing against China and Asia, and I guess reasserting regional dominance in the Western Hemisphere, a new Monroe Doctrine, if you will, but. He wants a solution for Ukraine. He wants peace with Russia. He wants to end the forever wars in the Middle East, but usually through his usual maximum pressure strategy to get what he wants. I was curious if you assess his objectives in a similar way, and how do you see him advancing towards these goals? Or again, I know it's this 2 weeks has been hard to follow what's going on, but I'm getting very mixed signals in terms of how he approaches both the Middle East as well as Russia.
Right. I wouldn't call them mixed signals. I'd call it noise. We have a lot of noise, and Trump dominates the news cycle. But in the morning, there are tariffs, and in the evening, there are no tariffs. There's a lot of theater involved in this. We don't know whether it's improvisation or the desire to dominate the cycle for its news cycle for its own sake. But I wouldn't overpress one's strategic vision on anything yet. I think it's quite early, quite confused, and we can't really say anything very clear about any of the main theaters of action, whether it is the Ukraine war, whether it is the Middle East, whether it is China, whether it is the Americas. Nothing has happened yet except a tremendous amount of noise and a tremendous amount of confusion. And Trump talks a lot. Populist leaders make their way with this kind of daily communication with their followers. It is a political tactic that works for populists. Lots and lots of communication throughout the day, throughout the night, posts, discussions, but they don't add up to uh, anything clear, I would say. So far, to my mind, there is only one grown-up discussion that has the mark of day-to-day continuity and rationality, and that is our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has given intelligent interviews and even conceptual discussions about a multipolar world. That's a good thing. Uh, he's our Secretary of State. He's called for diplomacy. He says diplomacy means mutual accommodation and compromise. We are in a multipolar world, he's declared. All of that I would put in the category of grown-up discussion. Everything else, we don't know. Honestly, Netanyahu is in Washington. Is it for them to plan the next phase of something awful because the U.S. is giving more heavy weapons and financing for Israel? That's already agreed. Or is it to lay down the law and say the current ceasefire will continue into a political outcome? We don't know. The theater in the Western Hemisphere is extraordinary. Can you imagine before this an American president basically posting daily that Canada is the 51st state? It's not funny. It is not conducive to any kind of of real solutions to issues. It's theater. It's Hollywood. It's past the popcorn. But people like it. But it's not actually solving anything. Uh, I think Rubio did one thing. It's interesting. Yes, he got the Panamanians to leave the Belt and Road Initiative. Uh, this is interesting. Basically, Trump is, as you said, clearly claiming American hegemony over the Americas as a whole. What would be interesting is if he would at least have the capacity mentally and geopolitically to say, well, if we don't want China and Russia nearby us, maybe they don't want the United States nearby them. If it actually reached that level of sophistication, the world would be safer. And so there could be some meaning in all of this. But remember, we're talking about Trump and we're talking about America. And America's perfectly capable of saying, we don't want Russia and China near us, and we will be right in their face. After all, just before we got on, I was reading how Trump has said, sure, now Ukraine will give us its rare earths in payment for our help. This is back to Lindsey Graham, the senator who said we must fight because there are $10 trillion of mineral reserves. Don't mind the Ukrainians, don't mind war, don't mind life and death. This is ours, these minerals. This is, again, it's a little bit discouraging that in the 21st century, uh, we have this kind of primitive approach to our hourly and daily life at a time of uh, trying to survive. We should recall that last week, as a backdrop to this, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock a second closer to Armageddon, to 89 seconds to midnight. That's a serious issue. So far, nothing that's happened has diminished those risks. So, Glenn, that's a long answer to say that we could possibly construct an intellectual framework around this, but I think it would be premature to do, actually.
You're probably right on this, but I found it interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the interview with Rubio, and this was extraordinary. I wish they would have unpacked it a bit more, to be honest, because this admission that the unipolar order has come to an end and we have to accept multipolarity, this, from my perspective, impacts everything. Because in a unipolar system, security means one country is able to dominate to such an extent no one can challenge its security. This is what brings stability in the unipolar logic, but in multipolar system you have to take into account the security concerns of adversaries. Now suddenly diplomacy takes on a whole new meaning. This would uproot the entire unipolar order which the US has attempted to build since the beginning of the 90s. So
That's
uh,
correct. And I thought the statements that Rubio made were quite intelligent. We have no idea whether that is his own observations or a reflection of a strategy agreed with President Trump. We don't hear such things from President Trump, anything at that conceptual level. So, but what Rubio said was what you and I and others have been discussing for years, which is that in fact we've already reached a multipolar world. Biden, Sullivan, Blinken never recognized it or acknowledged it or accepted it, at least at that political level. But Rubio said it quite straightforwardly. Um, that's the most positive single thing that has happened since the beginning of the administration. But it's quite possible that good things will happen, that the Ukraine war will stop, that the ceasefire will be enforced because Trump won't want more war. that the battles with China will be left to this mild tit for tat on trade. It's possible, actually, that peace breaks out in this way. Uh, but I think we're still very early days to make any assertions in that regard.
Well, you used the word confusion before, and I thought, well, this summarized my thoughts, not just on the Middle East, but also on the Ukraine issue, because Trump made it very clear he wants to end the war. Again, ideally, he would want it in the first 24 hours, but then extended it. When he said that he recognized NATO expansion triggered the war, this was very different from suggesting it was unprovoked, which means there was just an imperial impulse by Russia, which has to be countered as opposed to find a compromise. So I think the Russians were quite eager when they heard that it sounded like he was prepared to take their security concerns into interest and take this as a point of departure to find a solution. But then he went on to threaten the Russians instead with some sanctions. He was going to reduce the oil price. For some reason, he thought Saudi Arabia would go along with this. And but now he also is talking about Ukraine paying the U.S. with its rare earth minerals in order to finance American support. So again, it's if it's not mixed signals, it is confusing. Is it? He also wants to end the war, but he also suggests he's prepared to just dump it on the Europeans to let them deal with it from now on. Is this merely seeking a return on investment of US security commitments around the world as opposed to being a drain on resources, or do you think he has any wider ambitions in terms of ending conflict with the Russians to bring Russia a bit closer to the West as opposed to leaning towards China, or you think it's a lot of improvisation going on? Because I get it's it's a
Yes,
bit too much happening too fast, as I began saying.
I think a starting point is that there are many voices in Washington. There are many voices in the blob of the security establishment. Uh, President Putin famously observed in a 2017 interview that presidents come into office with ideas, but then men in dark suits and blue ties come and tell them about the realities. No doubt some of that is happening. By the way, he meant realities in quotation marks. In other words, deep state or CIA realities. So part of what is happening is that Trump's not alone. Even King George III, whom the U.S. Revolted against in 1776, was not alone. There was a cabinet, there was a parliament, and so forth. So Trump is not alone in this, though he completely dominates the news cycle. Maybe you could say he shares it with Elon Musk, but it's the two of them to the exclusion of everybody else almost in the world right now. So one thing is that there are many voices in Washington. There is a second point, I believe, uh, and that is that Trump probably either greatly overstates the hand that he has. In other words, that he thinks the U.S. bargaining power is much larger than it is, or he's a great BS artist and knows that the hand is weak, but therefore comes out with special bluster. But the point is, I don't think the U.S. has all so much leverage in many different places. The U.S. cannot face down China, for example, not even thinkable in our world. The U.S. can't win a war with China. God forbid there would be one. It could end the world. But it's not as if threats can really solve problems. The U.S. cannot threaten Saudi Arabia or the Arab world to say, you take the refugees from Gaza or else. There is no or else. The U.S. can't even threaten Europe if Europe, which is the worst bargainer in the whole world, of course, because it's 27 uh, some of which are vassal states of the US, trying to come up with some position. But even trade policy, the US market is just not so big and dominant, or the dollar so overwhelming. Quite the contrary, the US depends on financing from abroad, that Trump can just make threats, except if everybody cowers and falls into line. So there's a lot of bravado. There's a lot of confusion. There is, in my view, no clear strategy uh, at this stage, and there may not be a clear strategy. We should also understand that the US is filled with internal problems. The US is filled with internal political problems that are quite deep. We have a chronic budget deficit now of 7% of GDP, which is large, with a prospect of rapidly rising debt relative to national income, huge social issues that haven't even been mentioned once since the government came in. There's no talk about the health crisis, the social crisis, the poverty crisis, the housing crisis, except throw out illegal migrants. That's the only part of that discussion. And they want to spend more on the military. There's now talk of uh, trillions more on upgrading the nuclear so-called arsenal, plus uh, a new Iron Dome space-based anti-ballistic missile system of hundreds of billions of dollars of completely unproved technologies, uh, with budget cuts. That is Trump's greatest aspiration. So there are many, many, many deep contradictions, at, and I don't see them going away. Now, is it possible good things could happen? Yes. The way you started by imposing a coherent intellectual structure on all of this is absolutely a possible outcome that the administration could choose, which is retrenchment, which is peace with Russia, peace with China. You stay out of our neighborhood, we stay out of your neighborhood. We tone down, we return to a nuclear arms control framework. We end the war in the Middle East with a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel. All of that is within reach. It could be in 6 months that, my God, this is a new, sensible world. It's not impossible. Uh, but we shouldn't say that that's the strategy yet, because we have absolutely no confidence that that is the strategy, and that it is somehow the strategy that could be imposed by Trump and his team, even if they want it, because they're not alone in Washington.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to look into the chaos and the noise and see if I find some structure there. But yeah, Trump also not just about what he will do, but he inherited another conflict, of course, which is the genocide in Gaza. And here as well, I guess there's some assumption that it can go in both directions because on one hand, Trump wants to position himself as Israel's best friend. At the same time, he insists on America first. And when you have Netanyahu and Trump, it's I'm not sure if they will yeah, find a common note or if the room can't fit both egos. But again, on one hand, he wanted a ceasefire, but then the next day he's supplying 2,000-pound bombs and suggesting that we can resettle the Palestinians in Egypt and Jordan. Again, he framed this as helping them get a better life, but to clean out Gaza, uh, I guess from my perspective, looked like a humanitarian spin on ethnic cleansing. That is, first destroy Gaza and then offer help by removing the people. But how do you see any? How do you see the direction, or also irrespective of what Trump wants to do? Do you see the ceasefire holding, or will it be too difficult for Netanyahu to break it?
I think, again, here are some very clear basics. Netanyahu does not want a ceasefire. Netanyahu does not want a political solution with Palestine. Netanyahu wants, for his own ideological purposes, his political survival, the survival of his coalition, what is called Greater Israel, which means that Israel uh, controls all of the territory of mandatory Palestine, that is the British era Palestine, meaning from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, both what is the legal boundaries of Israel plus East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So that's what Netanyahu wants. And he's wanted that since he first became prime minister in 1996. And nothing has changed, and there's no common ground on that. And he will never change his position on that. He will rise or fall from power. That's a different matter. But he will not change his position on that. That is his political core and his life's work. And it's a disaster, in my view. The man is absolutely under an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and war crimes to perpetrate his political vision, which is Greater Israel. The United States has had a choice for decades whether to go along with this and fight Israel's wars or whether to say there needs to be peace and a two-state solution. Up until today, the U.S. has always sided with Israel. This is the so-called Israel lobby power. It's dominating in Washington. Uh, the question is whether Trump is a part of that or not. If you had to bet, you would say yes. If you would think it through from the point of view of the United States interests and Trump's interests, you would say no. Biden lost power, probably the whole administration lost re-election in large part because of its weakness of foreign policy and in large part by handing over Middle East policy to the Israel lobby. This cost the Democrats dearly in the swing states and in the general attitude that the U.S. government was not in control. Trump has a choice as a president. The job of a president is to lead, but there has been no leadership, basically almost going back to Truman, about Israel because the political lobby of Israel has been so powerful all along. So this is exactly what's at stake this week. Uh, I'm waiting to see rather than predicting, because if you were to predict, you would predict that the Israel lobby would continue, and if you would hope for peace, you would say that Trump would lay down the law and tell Netanyahu, I don't care what's happening to you. I care that this war is not starting again, and that's it, and send him packing. That's what a president would do. We haven't had one like that for many, many, many presidents. So this is what's at stake this week.
It is, yeah, one other big thing that's happening as well, which is the under Trump, suspending, well, what's referred to as foreign aid for 90 days, which hits institutions such as USAID, but also these other NGOs, which have often been criticized for being, well, they're called non-governmental organizations, but they're financed by the US government. They're often staffed by people closely aligned with the intelligence community. Sometimes it is the intelligence community, and often the way they interpret human rights tends to always align with geopolitical interest. Now, by defunding this, there's already been huge consequences. We hear from Ukraine, for example, all this media, often 80 to 90% are financed by these US so-called NGOs, and even from Hungary, the opposition media, which tries to undermine Orban, has also lost a lot of its financing. So it seems quite, yeah, it's a huge development, and I guess I'm wondering where the motivation is. Is this an effort because he wants to remake a lot of America's foreign policies? Is this a way of uprooting the deep state? Is it simply pragmatic cost cutting measures, or is it geopolitical? Because only the last month these NGOs have had. The former prime minister, the current prime minister of Georgia, warned that the United States was trying to topple the government there with NGOs to make them into a second front line. In Slovakia, they're arguing that this attempt to be NGOs are trying to topple him if because he's too favorable of ending the war in Ukraine, same as Orban. So is this geopolitical interest of Trump? Is he cutting costs? Is it uprooting deep state? How are you reading this whole thing? Because it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a very good set of questions. Again, I'm sorry to say, it's probably a number of motives that are different by different actors. But let me summarize it this way. First of all, USAID is a mix of uh, three very different missions. One is true uh, and urgent humanitarian aid to help finance safe water or anti-malaria medicines and so forth that keep people alive urgently. USAID really does that. You stop that, people die. And so that's the good side of USAID. Second, USAID is an instrument of foreign policy, obviously, of the United States, not only of development or humanitarian policy. You help those who vote with the U.S., side with the U.S., allow the U.S. to establish military bases, fight alongside the U.S., and so forth. So it is a completely politicized institution that is hopelessly misused for sometimes nefarious foreign policy grounds. Third, it is a deep state institution, which is that it funds literally color revolutions, insurrections, and so forth. And it provides opposition media that springs up upon demand when a government is to be overthrown, for example. So it's all of those things. And it's not uh, this action that was taken did not delineate among them, at least in the first order. Afterwards, some of the life-saving uh, operations were restored. I'm sure many not. What was the purpose of all of this? It's, again, a mix. Foreign aid, the good part, saving lives and so forth, this is by itself opposed by core Trump constituencies. Doing good for others, stop that. Believe me, cut foreign aid, that's waste. Why would we help them? This is a very common trope in American politics, which is if it's good for others, it's bad for us. And so, ironically, it's not like people said, well, we should save the good stuff. No, 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 no. We should cut the good stuff because that's a waste of money. If they want to stay alive, that's their business. That's not our business, is an American trope. But it's also true that probably this was an attack on the deep state in a way I would applaud because USAID got hopelessly, terribly misused for decades. I'm a development economist. I uh, uh, championed development help for poor people, but I would stop dealing with USID because it was a completely political instrument and often a totally inappropriate instrument. And so I think that this was also part of the motivation, to be sure. Uh, in general, by the way, in the West, even in Norway, which is one of the big donors, even throughout Western Europe, the idea of helping people honestly to meet their basic needs is going out of fashion. It's incredible the levels of selfishness, self-regard, and so forth against the most vulnerable people in the world. So USAID will not be saved because of a groundswell of support that we should help vulnerable people. It will be saved if it is by deep state forces that say we need this as a foreign policy tool for all the wrong reasons, in my view. But what it does do is what you said. It's amazing to watch how many front organizations have been exposed within a week. Suddenly, you can't propagandize. Suddenly, half the media in Ukraine is down because it was all US funded. It was USAID funded. This is the game of the US security state. This is the game of color revolutions. And at least temporarily, it was stopped. So we have a very good experiment underway that exposes what was going on.
Yeah, I agree. And I just, yeah, so Bill Kristol, he tweeted out yesterday, I rather stand with the deep state than the Trump state. So it's
I
remarkable that they can say this out loud.
Exactly. And Bill Kristol is one of the people that has brought us more wars, more disaster, closer to the brink of nuclear war. He's part of that neocon group from the start that has done so much profound damage. For him to say that at least clarifies, we hope that the Trump state will actually be on the other side of that. We're waiting to see. But if it is, that would be exactly the breakthrough to reality and to security that we need in the United States and that the world needs.
I just one final brief question. I was curious how you see China, to be honest, because in 2017, when Trump took the presidency, he was very eager on economic coercion against China. But since those days, it appears that China has shown it's able to diversify away from the US in terms of chip making, while the US obviously will struggle much more to diversify away from China, especially when it comes to rare earth metals and yeah, a lot of the resources which the US supply chains are dependent on. Are you picking up on any more moderate sentiment or approach by Trump this time, or is it hard to see through the noise, I guess?
Again, what the Trump group will decide is one matter, but the most important single thing that happened, not by Trump, but in the last weeks in geopolitics was DeepSeek, was the Chinese demonstration that that's all fine and good, all your bluster and bandy and your hundreds of billions of dollars on expensive chips, but we can replicate what you're doing. And there are cheaper ways to do all of this. And don't worry, we're here. That was the real message of DeepSeek. And the truth is, this is a long story. The idea that the US dominates because it has a chokehold on some key technology has been a trope for at least, let's say, since 1945. The idea in 1945 was that the US had the atomic monopoly when Truman uh, reflected how long that monopoly would last. He said forever. Of course, it lasted for about 3.5 years. And in 1949, the Soviet Union joined the atomic club, and it followed similarly with the thermonuclear bomb in 1953-54. The point is, all of these ideas that, well, we're ahead and we will stay ahead technologically, is just a long-standing, oft-repeated, naive trope Star Wars was the same thing, and it goes on and on and on. AI is just the latest of this hype. China is a global superpower. It will be so. Trump has no credible threats against it. It doesn't mean that the U.S. won't be utterly stupid, but the U.S. cannot defeat, contain China, but the U.S. could get along with China peacefully just fine if Marco Rubio's observation is wisely heeded that we are truly in a multipolar world. Because the implication of that is you don't go to war with the other party because they can't defeat you, you can't defeat them. But the only thing that both sides could do is blow up the whole world. And so you stay clear of each other. And again, I want to come back to the most basic idea. Well, it's the golden rule. It's several thousand years old in global thought, in every single ethical tradition, major tradition in the world. You do to others what you would have them do to you. And Trump does not want Russia and China on our borders or in our nearby waters. Maybe if the United States reflects on that vis-a-vis the East China Sea, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and so forth, we'll have a safer world. It's possible we're going to get there. These are the first days, lots and lots of noise, lots of confusion. Washington is in a tizzy. Trump is not alone in Washington. Things are upended. My underlying point is we could have a safer world, and the United States hand is not very strong. So there's lots of noise and bluster and threat and boasting and puffing and huffing. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. can stop wars, but it can't win them, and it shouldn't fight them.
Well, hopefully we'll get back to the notion that security derives from yeah, mitigating the security competition, not defeating your adversaries.
That's it. That's exactly it.
But anyways, Professor Sachs, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights. Very much
Great to be
appreciated.
with you, and we'll stay in touch on watching these developments.
Well,
Great. Thanks a lot.